Stop. Right now, look at your hands. See those tiny cuts? In 1347, any one of them would have killed you in 72 hours. I've studied thousands of medieval documents and discovered one terrifying truth. 98% of people didn't die from wars or plague, but from things so simple you wouldn't even think twice about them. Today I'm going to tell you the story of Thomas the Baker, who figured out how to literally cheat death. But first, do you know what happened to your teeth after just 1 week of medieval life? Spoiler alert, you wouldn't need a toothbrush anymore. If you think you know what it was like living back then, buckle up. What I'm about to tell you will make you see your ordinary life in a completely different way. And yeah, by the end you'll understand why Thomas was an absolute survival genius. The marketplace where Thomas first realized his predicament was like stepping into another world entirely. Imagine cobblestones worn smooth by centuries of cartwheels and footsteps, fitted so perfectly that grass grew only in the tiniest cracks. The air carried scents that no longer exist. The sweet smell of hay from horse stalls, the sharp tang of leather from the cobbler's workshop, the warm aroma of fresh bread mixing with earthier smells of turnips and onions. In this world without clocks, people lived by the rhythm of the sun and seasons. Dawn meant work, sunset meant rest, and the changing light told everyone exactly what time it was. Thomas knew, just by the quality of light through his bakery window, whether he was running early or late with his morning's work. Tonight, we'll walk alongside Thomas through cobblestone streets that haven't existed for centuries, breathe in the aroma of his bakery at dawn, and discover how one man's gentle rebellion against a cruel lord became local legend. It's a story about creativity, kindness, and the quiet ways that ordinary people can change the world around them. This isn't just about medieval times. It's about the timeless human capacity to find solutions where none seem to exist, to protect those we care about through ingenuity rather than force. Thomas's story reminds us that ordinary people, armed with nothing more than skill, creativity, and determination, can indeed change their world. So take a deep breath, let your shoulders relax, and let's step back in time together. Feel the cool morning air of a world that moved at the pace of walking, where neighbors knew each other's names, where the baker's craft was both humble and essential. Close your eyes if you'd like, and imagine oil lamps flickering in windows, the distant sound of a church bell, the gentle rustling of thatched roofs in the evening breeze. This is the world of Thomas the Baker, and tonight it becomes your world too. The village of Little Thornbury was stirring to life as the first pale fingers of sunrise crept over the thatched rooftops. In 1347, this was a world without clocks as we know them. People rose with the sun and slept with the stars, their lives governed by the natural rhythm of light and shadow. The morning air itself told stories that we can barely imagine today. No industrial pollution clouded the sky, no automobile exhaust tainted the breeze. Instead, the air carried the sweet perfume of wildflowers blooming in cottage gardens, the green scent of dew-heavy grass, and the comforting smoke from dozens of chimneys as families rekindled their fires from the carefully banked coals that had glowed through the night. Thomas emerged from his small stone cottage, attached to his bakery, just as he had every morning for the past 15 years. His cottage was built in the style of the time, thick stone walls that kept the interior cool in summer and warm in winter, small windows with wooden shutters instead of glass, and a thatched roof that had been renewed just the previous spring. The thatch was made from locally grown wheat straw, layered so skillfully that it would shed rain like a duck's back while providing excellent insulation. At 32, Thomas was considered a master of his craft, his hands permanently dusted with flour, his back slightly bent from years of kneading dough and lifting heavy sacks of grain. His clothing was typical of a prosperous craftsman. A woolen tunic dyed the rich brown that came from walnut hulls, woolen hose that reached to his knees, and leather shoes that he had made himself during the quiet winter evenings. Over this, he wore a leather apron that bore the stains and marks of countless days of baking. Flour ground so deep into the leather that it had become part of the material itself. The air was crisp and clean in a way that's hard to imagine today. No car exhaust, no industrial smoke, just the sweet scent of wood smoke curling from chimneys, and the earthy smell of the vegetable gardens that surrounded each home. Thomas breathed deeply, savoring these quiet moments before the day truly began. The silence was profound but not empty, filled with the subtle sounds of a world waking up, the soft lowing of cattle in distant fields, the gentle clucking of chickens in backyard coops, the whisper of wind through the leaves of the great oak that stood at the village center. His bakery was a modest affair, a single room with a massive stone oven that dominated one wall. The oven had been built by his father and grandfather before him, each stone carefully selected from the local quarry and fitted with the precision that comes from generations of accumulated skill. The stones had been chosen not just for their ability to withstand heat, but for their capacity to absorb and slowly release that heat, creating the perfect environment for baking bread. When lit, the oven would hold heat for hours, allowing Thomas to bake dozens of loaves in sequence as the temperature gradually decreased. The hottest heat for the crusty loaves, the moderate heat for softer breads, and the gentle warmth for the delicate pastries that he sometimes made for special occasions. The morning routine was as familiar to Thomas as his own heartbeat. First, he would examine the embers from yesterday's fire, carefully preserved under a layer of ash. These glowing coals were precious. Starting a fire from scratch was time-consuming and difficult, so maintaining the continuous spark from day to day was essential. Using a long wooden paddle, he would rake the coals to one side of the oven, then feed them with carefully selected pieces of dry wood. Oak was best for the initial heat, burning hot and clean, while applewood added a subtle sweetness to the air that would eventually perfume the bread. But this morning, something was different. A piece of parchment had been nailed to his door, an official notice bearing the seal of Lord Aldrich, the local nobleman who ruled over Little Thornbury and 6 other villages in the area. The parchment was made from sheepskin, scraped thin and smooth, a valuable material that ordinary villagers rarely saw except in official documents. The seal pressed into the red wax was elaborate, showing Lord Aldrich's coat of arms, a rampant lion surrounded by wheat sheaves, symbols meant to represent both his authority and his stewardship of the agricultural lands under his control. Thomas couldn't read. Few people could in those days, but he recognized the seal, and his stomach immediately knotted with worry. Official notices from Lord Aldrich were never good news. They usually meant increased taxes, new regulations, or demands for additional labor during harvest time. The very sight of that red wax seal was enough to turn a peaceful morning into a day of anxiety and concern. In medieval times, literacy was largely confined to the clergy and a few wealthy nobles. Most people, even skilled craftsmen like Thomas, learned their trades through apprenticeship and practice, passing knowledge down through demonstration and oral instruction rather than written manuals. This meant that official documents held a particular power. They were mysterious, potentially threatening things that ordinary people couldn't interpret for themselves. He would have to wait for Brother Marcus, the village priest who could read Latin and some English, to tell him what the parchment said. But Thomas had a sinking feeling he already knew. Lord Aldrich had been growing increasingly demanding lately, taking larger and larger portions of the village's harvest, leaving barely enough for the villagers to survive the winter. The pressure seemed to come from his desire to maintain a lifestyle that exceeded his actual resources, leading him to squeeze his tenants and vassals ever more tightly. As Thomas began his morning routine, rekindling the fire in his oven, checking his stores of flour and salt, other villagers began to appear. The village was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's routine, and Thomas's bakery was often the first stop of the day for many families. Mary the seamstress emerged from her cottage next door, her basket already filled with mending work. She was a widow in her 40s, with graying hair that she kept covered with a simple linen cap, and hands that were permanently stained with the dyes she used in her work. Her cottage was smaller than Thomas's, just 2 rooms with a tiny garden where she grew the plants she used for creating colored threads, madder for red, woad for blue, and various flowers and berries for yellows and browns. Old William the shepherd appeared from the direction of the common grazing lands, leading his flock toward the fields where they would spend the day. He was past 60, ancient by medieval standards, his face weathered by decades of outdoor work and his hands gnarled by arthritis. But his eyes were still sharp, and his knowledge of weather patterns, animal behavior, and local conditions was encyclopedic. He could predict rain by the way his sheep gathered together, forecast the severity of winter by observing how thick the animals' coats grew, and find lost livestock by reading tracks that others couldn't even see. Young Peter the blacksmith's apprentice hurried toward the forge where his master was already working, the ring of hammer on anvil echoing across the quiet morning. Peter was barely 18, tall and lanky with the kind of nervous energy that comes from youth and ambition. His master, Robert the smith, was teaching him not just the practical skills of metalworking, but the more subtle arts of understanding iron and fire, of knowing exactly when metal had reached the right temperature for shaping, of creating tools that would serve their users for decades with proper care. These were Thomas's neighbors, his friends, people he'd known his entire life. Their families had lived in Little Thornbury for generations, their lives intertwined like the threads in one of Mary's tapestries. When someone fell ill, the whole village rallied to help. When crops failed, they shared what little they had. When a barn burned down or a roof needed repair, everyone contributed labor and materials without being asked. It was a simple life, but it was built on something precious: community bonds forged by shared hardship and mutual dependence. This interdependence wasn't just social, but deeply practical. The blacksmith needed the baker's bread, but the baker needed the smith's tools. The seamstress required the shepherd's wool, but the shepherd needed his clothes mended. The priest provided spiritual guidance and literacy, but he depended on the farmers for food and the craftsmen for the material goods that made life possible. Everyone had a role, everyone contributed something essential, and everyone benefited from the contributions of others. And now, Thomas feared, that community was under threat. The delicate balance that allowed everyone to prosper modestly was being disrupted by Lord Aldrich's increasing demands. If the Lord took too much, the entire system could collapse, leaving families hungry and desperate as winter approached. Brother Marcus arrived just as Thomas was pulling his first batch of loaves from the oven. The priest's usually cheerful face was grave as he approached the bakery, his brown woolen robes rustling softly as he walked. Brother Marcus was a man in his 50s, with the kind of gentle intelligence that made him both an effective spiritual leader and a trusted advisor to the villagers. His monastery training had given him not just literacy, but a broader understanding of the political and economic forces that shaped rural life. "Thomas, my friend," Brother Marcus said softly, "I'm afraid the news is not good." The parchment, it turned out, contained Lord Aldrich's latest decree, written in the formal Latin that was used for all official documents. Beginning immediately, all bakers in his domain were required to deliver half their daily production to the Lord's castle, not to be paid for, but as an additional tax. The official reason given was to support Lord Aldrich's preparations for potential conflicts with neighboring lords, though Brother Marcus explained quietly that the real reason was simpler and more troubling. Lord Aldrich had grown fond of lavish feasts and expensive imports. His lifestyle had become increasingly extravagant, and he was squeezing his villages to pay for it. Recent visitors to the castle had reported seeing fine tapestries from Flanders, exotic spices from the Mediterranean, and French wines that cost more than most villagers earned in a year. Meanwhile, essential repairs to roads and bridges were being neglected, and the Lord's promises to maintain adequate military protection for the villages were becoming increasingly hollow. For Thomas, this decree was devastating. He barely made enough from his baking to support himself and his elderly mother, who lived in a small cottage at the other end of the village. His mother, Agnes, was in her 70s and could no longer work, depending entirely on Thomas for her care. Giving away half his bread would mean financial ruin, and for the village, it would mean real hunger. Bread wasn't just food in medieval times. It was the foundation of survival, especially with winter approaching. Bread formed the core of every meal for ordinary people. A typical family might eat bread with cheese for breakfast, bread with vegetable soup for the midday meal, and bread with small beer, a weak, safe alcoholic drink, for supper. Meat was a luxury reserved for special occasions. Fresh vegetables were only available during growing season, and preserved foods were expensive and not always reliable. Without adequate bread, families would face genuine starvation, particularly the children and elderly, who were most vulnerable to malnutrition. As word of the decree spread through the village, Thomas saw the worry creep into his neighbors' faces. They depended on his affordable bread to supplement their own meager meals. Without it, some families might not make it through the cold months ahead. The reality of medieval life was that survival margins were thin, and any disruption to the food supply could have catastrophic consequences. Mary approached with her children, 2 young boys and a girl of perhaps 12, their faces showing the premature seriousness that poverty forced on children. "Thomas," she said quietly, "what will we do? The children, they're already so thin from last winter's shortages." Old William joined the growing crowd, his weathered face set in grim lines. "Been through lean times before," he said, "but this feels different, more desperate." Young Peter looked confused and frightened. His master paid him partly in bread, and if Thomas couldn't provide that bread, Peter's own survival would be threatened. The interconnected nature of village life meant that a blow to one family rippled outward to affect everyone. That's when Thomas made a decision that would change everything. He looked at the worried faces around him, at the children clinging to their mother's skirts, at old William's weathered hands shaking slightly as he realized what this might mean for his family. These people had supported his family's bakery for generations, had celebrated his successes, and helped him through difficult times. They weren't just customers, they were his community, his extended family. "Don't worry," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough for his neighbors to hear. "I have an idea." The words were spoken softly, but they carried the weight of a promise. Thomas didn't yet know exactly what he was going to do, but he knew he would find a way. Somehow he would meet Lord Aldrich's unreasonable demands while still protecting his community. It would require all his skill, creativity, and courage, but looking at the faces of his neighbors, Thomas knew he had no choice but to try. As the morning wore on and the usual bustle of village life continued around him, Thomas found his mind working furiously. He had always been a thoughtful man, the kind who observed more than he spoke, who found solutions in quiet contemplation rather than bold action. The problem seemed impossible at first glance. How could he satisfy Lord Aldrich's demands while still providing for his village? The math was simple and brutal. There simply wasn't enough bread to go around if half went to the castle. But as Thomas kneaded his afternoon batch of dough, his hands working with the automatic rhythm developed over decades, an idea began to form. It was risky, incredibly risky, but it might just work. The key lay in understanding Lord Aldrich's character. The Lord was vain, easily flattered, and had a weakness for anything that made him appear clever or sophisticated to his peers. He also had very little understanding of common folks' daily lives. In his mind, bread was bread. He had no concept of the skill and artistry that went into baking, no appreciation for the subtle differences between one loaf and another. Thomas's plan was beautifully simple, and that's what made it so dangerous. If it worked, he could satisfy the Lord's demands while protecting his village. If it failed, well, deliberately deceiving a feudal lord was a crime that could result in severe punishment, possibly even death. But looking around at his neighbors, at Mary struggling to stretch her small portions of grain, at the baker's children growing thinner each day, Thomas knew he had to try. The first step was preparation. Thomas began to alter his baking routine in small but significant ways. Instead of making his usual hearty, dense loaves packed with nutrition and designed to keep village families fed for days, he began experimenting with different techniques. He discovered that by adding more water to his dough and incorporating more air during the kneading process, he could create loaves that looked impressive, tall, golden, with a beautiful crust, but were actually much lighter and less filling than his usual bread. They were still delicious, perhaps even more appealing to someone who judged food by appearance rather than sustenance, but they contained significantly less actual nutrition and substance. For the castle's portion, these would be perfect. Lord Aldrich would receive bread that looked magnificent, bread that would impress his guests and satisfy his vanity. But these decorative loaves would use far less of Thomas's precious flour and other ingredients than substantial, nourishing bread. The flour he saved by making lighter bread for the castle, Thomas could use to continue making his traditional hearty loaves for the village, albeit smaller and fewer than before, but still enough to keep families fed. It was a baker's version of creative accounting, and it required every bit of skill Thomas had developed over his lifetime. The technical challenge was significant. Creating two completely different types of bread without anyone noticing required careful timing, separate batches of dough, and meticulous organization. Thomas would have to wake even earlier, work even longer hours, and maintain the pretense that he was simply fulfilling the Lord's decree without any cleverness on his part. But there was another element to Thomas's plan, one that was perhaps even more risky but absolutely essential for its success. He couldn't just make different bread. He had to make Lord Aldrich believe that this fancy bread was exactly what a sophisticated nobleman deserved, while the village bread was common fare suitable only for peasants. This is where Thomas's understanding of human nature became crucial. He knew that people often value things more highly when they believe those things are exclusive or special. If he could convince Lord Aldrich that the castle was receiving a superior product, something fancy and refined, then the Lord would be satisfied and perhaps even proud of his tax policy. So Thomas began to research. He spoke with traveling merchants who passed through the village, asking casually about the latest fashions in bread making in larger towns and cities. He listened to stories from Brother Marcus, who occasionally traveled to other monasteries and heard news from the wider world. Slowly, Thomas developed a story. The bread he would send to the castle would be made in the French style, lighter, more refined, suitable for the sophisticated palate of nobility. He even gave it a name, pain de château, castle bread. The name sounded impressively foreign and elegant, exactly the sort of thing that would appeal to Lord Aldrich's pretensions. Meanwhile, the bread for the village would simply be described as traditional English bread, hearty and filling, exactly what hard-working common folk needed to sustain themselves through long days of labor. The beautiful irony of Thomas's plan was that both descriptions were technically true. The castle bread was indeed lighter and more refined in appearance. The village bread was indeed hearty and designed for sustenance. Thomas wasn't exactly lying. He was simply presenting the facts in a particular light. As he worked through the details of his plan over several days, Thomas felt a mixture of excitement and terror. He was essentially betting his life that he could outwit a nobleman through nothing more than superior bread-making skills and a deep understanding of human psychology. But every time doubt crept in, Thomas looked around his village and remembered what was at stake. These weren't just his customers. They were his family, his community, the people who had supported him through good times and bad. If he could protect them through his craft, through the skills passed down from his father and grandfather, then he had to try. The morning came when Thomas would deliver his first batch of bread to the castle. His hands shook slightly as he carefully arranged the golden, airy loaves in his delivery basket, covering them with his finest cloth. These loaves looked magnificent. They practically glowed in the morning sunlight, their crusts perfect, their shape impressive. Hidden beneath his workbench, wrapped in simpler cloth, were smaller but more nourishing loaves for his village customers. These looked humble by comparison, but Thomas knew they would provide better nutrition and keep families satisfied longer. As he set off toward Lord Aldrich's castle, Thomas whispered a quiet prayer. He was about to discover whether a baker's skill and a good heart could triumph over greed and power. The walk to the castle took about 30 minutes along a well-worn path that wound through fields and small woodlands. As Thomas approached the imposing stone structure, its towers rising against the autumn sky, he felt his nervousness growing, but he also felt something else, a quiet confidence in his craft and his plan. Today would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of his entire village, and it all came down to bread. The castle of Lord Aldrich was not the massive fortress you might imagine from fairy tales, but rather a modest stone keep surrounded by a wooden palisade. Still, to Thomas, who had rarely ventured beyond his village, it seemed imposing and alien. The guards at the gate were young men from nearby villages, and Thomas recognized one of them, Edgar, whose family had bought bread from Thomas's father years ago. "Morning, Thomas," Edgar said quietly, his voice carrying a note of sympathy. Word of the new tax had spread quickly, and everyone knew what it meant for the village families. "Morning, Edgar. I'm here to deliver bread to Lord Aldrich, as requested," Thomas replied, keeping his voice steady and formal. Even friendly guards might report conversations to their lord, and Thomas couldn't afford to seem anything other than completely compliant. Edgar led Thomas through the courtyard, past servants going about their morning tasks, tending horses, drawing water from the well, preparing for the day's activities. The castle felt busy but not particularly wealthy. Thomas noticed that some of the buildings needed repair, and the servants' clothing, while clean, showed signs of careful mending. This observation actually encouraged Thomas. If Lord Aldrich was having financial difficulties, he might be even more susceptible to flattery and anything that made him feel important or sophisticated. They entered the main hall, a large stone room with high ceilings and tapestries hanging on the walls. At one end, on a slightly raised platform, sat Lord Aldrich at a wooden table. He was a man in his late 40s, dressed in fine clothes, but not ostentatiously so. His face showed the soft roundness that came from good living, but his eyes held a sharp intelligence that made Thomas immediately more cautious. "Ah, the baker," Lord Aldrich said without looking up from the piece of parchment he was examining. "You've brought the first installment of bread, I assume?" "Yes, my lord," Thomas replied, bowing respectfully. "I've brought the finest bread my humble bakery can produce, prepared specially for your lordship's refined tastes." This was the moment of truth. Thomas carefully unwrapped his basket, revealing the golden, perfectly shaped loaves within. They truly did look magnificent. The morning light streaming through the hall's windows made them appear almost aglow. Lord Aldrich looked up for the first time, and Thomas was relieved to see genuine appreciation in his expression. The lord rose from his chair and approached the basket, examining the bread with obvious interest. "These look different from what I expected," Lord Aldrich said, and Thomas's heart skipped a beat. Had he made them too obviously fancy, too different from normal bread? "Yes, my lord," Thomas said carefully. "I've taken the liberty of preparing these loaves in the French style. Pain de château, they call it, much lighter and more refined than the heavy peasant bread common in our region. I thought a man of your sophistication would appreciate something more elegant." Lord Aldrich picked up one of the loaves, testing its weight. Thomas held his breath. The bread was indeed much lighter than traditional loaves, but would the Lord interpret this as refinement, or as Thomas trying to cheat him? "Pain de château," Lord Aldrich repeated, clearly enjoying the foreign sound of the words. "And this is popular among the French nobility?" "So I'm told by the traveling merchants, my lord," Thomas replied honestly. "They say it's quite fashionable in the great houses of France. The lighter texture allows for more subtle flavors to emerge, and the appearance is considered much more elegant for formal dining." Lord Aldrich broke off a piece of the bread and tasted it. Thomas watched his face carefully, trying to read his reaction. The bread was genuinely delicious. The lighter texture made it more delicate, almost pastry-like, and the crust had a beautiful color and crunch. "Interesting," Lord Aldrich murmured. "Very different from what our local bakers usually produce. More sophisticated." Thomas allowed himself a small sigh of relief. The Lord was interpreting the bread exactly as Thomas had hoped, as a sign of his own refined tastes, rather than as a deception. "I'm honored that my humble skills meet with your approval, my lord," Thomas said. "I've studied the techniques carefully to ensure that your lordship receives bread worthy of your station." Lord Aldrich smiled, clearly pleased with this flattery. "Excellent. And you can maintain this quality consistently?" "Absolutely, my lord. I've dedicated myself to perfecting these techniques for your benefit." "Good, good." Lord Aldrich returned to his seat, but his posture had relaxed. He seemed genuinely pleased with both the bread and the story Thomas had crafted around it. "I expect deliveries every other day, as specified in the decree." "And baker?" "Yes, my lord." "Make sure you continue producing your regular bread for the villagers as well. We can't have them going hungry and becoming unable to work properly." Thomas bowed deeply, both to show respect and to hide his smile. "Of course, my lord. The villagers will continue to receive good, substantial bread to keep them strong for their labors." "Excellent. Dismissed." As Thomas walked back through the courtyard, his empty basket swinging at his side, he felt a mixture of triumph and nervousness. The first test had been successful. Lord Aldrich had accepted both the bread and the story behind it. But this was just the beginning. Thomas would need to maintain this deception consistently, while actually increasing his workload significantly. Still, as he reached the village and saw Mary waiting outside his bakery with her children, their faces brightened with hope when they saw him returning safely. Thomas knew he had made the right choice. "How did it go?" Mary asked quietly. "Well enough," Thomas replied. There will be bread for everyone today. And there was. While Lord Aldrich enjoyed his elegant pain de chateau with his afternoon meal, praising its sophistication to his visiting steward, the families of Little Thornbury sat down to hearty, nourishing loaves that would sustain them through their work and into the next day. Thomas had successfully begun his gentle rebellion, and no one was the wiser. As the weeks passed, Thomas settled into a routine that was both exhausting and strangely satisfying. Each day began before dawn when the world was still wrapped in darkness and silence. He would light his fire and begin preparing 2 entirely different types of dough, each requiring its own timing and techniques. The process had become almost meditative. In the quiet hours before sunrise, with only the crackling of the fire for company, Thomas would knead and shape, his hands working with the unconscious skill of long practice. There was something deeply peaceful about this work. The warmth of the oven gradually filling the bakery, the yeasty smell of rising dough permeating the air, the satisfying rhythm of creation that connected him to countless generations of bakers who had performed these same rituals. The bakery in these early hours felt like a sacred space, illuminated only by the flickering glow from the oven and a single oil lamp that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. The silence was so complete that Thomas could hear the subtle sounds of his craft, the soft whisper of flour being sifted, the gentle slap of dough against the wooden work surface, the faint crackling as the bread's crust formed in the oven's heat. For the castle bread, Thomas had refined his technique even further. He discovered that by adding a small amount of honey and using a slightly different kneading method, he could create loaves that were not only lighter but also had a subtle sweetness that Lord Aldrich particularly enjoyed. The honey was expensive. Thomas had to trade some of his regular bread to the local beekeeper for it, but it was worth the cost to maintain the illusion of luxury. The honey came from Brother Marcus's monastery, where the monks maintained several hives as part of their commitment to self-sufficiency. The golden, viscous liquid had to be warmed gently before it could be incorporated into the dough, and its addition required adjusting the amounts of other ingredients to maintain the proper texture. But the result was bread that not only looked elegant, but actually tasted more refined than ordinary loaves. Thomas also experimented with the shaping of these special loaves. Instead of the simple round or oval forms that characterized everyday bread, he began creating more elaborate shapes, twisted spirals that caught the light beautifully, braided forms that suggested sophisticated artistry, and decorative patterns pressed into the crust using wooden stamps that he carved himself during the long winter evenings. The village bread, meanwhile, had evolved too. With practice, Thomas found ways to make his traditional loaves even more nutritious and filling. He began incorporating small amounts of barley and oats when he could get them, creating bread that was perhaps simpler in appearance than the castle loaves, but far superior in sustaining power. The barley came from old William's small plot of land, where he grew a hardy variety that could survive in poor soil and harsh weather. The oats were obtained through barter with farmers in neighboring villages, traded for some of Thomas's specialty breads during market days. These additional grains not only improved the nutritional value of the village bread, but also helped stretch the precious wheat flour, allowing Thomas to feed more families with the same amount of basic ingredients. Thomas developed techniques for grinding these additional grains to the perfect consistency, coarse enough to add texture and substance, fine enough to blend smoothly with the wheat flour. He used a small hand quern that had belonged to his grandfather, turning the heavy stones by hand in the pre-dawn darkness, the rhythmic motion becoming another meditative element of his morning routine. The villagers, initially worried about how Thomas was managing to fulfill Lord Aldrich's demands while still providing for them, gradually relaxed as they realized their baker had somehow found a solution. They didn't ask too many questions. In medieval times, it was often safer not to know exactly how problems were being solved, especially when those solutions might involve outwitting the local lord. This discretion was born of practical wisdom. Villagers understood that their survival often depended on maintaining a careful balance between compliance and resistance, between honoring their obligations to their lord while protecting their own interests. They had learned to recognize when someone was working for the community's benefit, and to support that work through silence and subtle cooperation rather than direct involvement. Mary the seamstress demonstrated this understanding perfectly. She began timing her daily visits to the bakery to coincide with Thomas's busiest periods, casually positioning herself to block the view of anyone who might be watching while Thomas prepared his different types of bread. Her presence seemed natural, just a neighbor stopping by for her daily loaf, but it provided valuable cover for Thomas's more delicate operations. Old William contributed in his own way, using his morning and evening walks to monitor who was moving around the village and when. His sheep-herding duties gave him a legitimate reason to be out at all hours, and his sharp eyes could spot approaching strangers or potential trouble long before they reached the bakery. A casual comment about unusual visitors, or a subtle warning about officials on the road, often gave Thomas time to adjust his activities accordingly. Brother Marcus, however, was more observant. One morning, as he stopped by the bakery for his daily loaf, he watched Thomas working with his usual careful attention. The priest had the educated person's habit of noticing details that others might miss, and his position in the church hierarchy had taught him to recognize the signs of creative problem-solving that might not strictly comply with official requirements. "Thomas, my friend," the priest said gently, "I can't help but notice that you seem to be working much harder these days, yet you're somehow managing to keep everyone fed. Should I ask how you're accomplishing this miracle?" Thomas paused in his kneading, considering his response. Brother Marcus was not only a friend, but also the spiritual guide of the village. Thomas trusted him, but he also knew that the priest position required him to maintain certain loyalties to both the villagers and the church hierarchy, which had its own complex relationship with the nobility. The church occupied a unique position in medieval society, technically independent of secular authority, but practically dependent on noble patronage for protection and support. Priests often found themselves walking a careful line between their pastoral duties to ordinary people and their institutional obligations to the powerful. Brother Marcus had always seemed to prioritize his care for the villagers, but Thomas couldn't be entirely certain how the priest would react to learning about deliberate deception of a lord. "I've simply been creative with my baking techniques," Thomas said carefully, "finding ways to make the most of what we have." Brother Marcus studied Thomas's face for a moment, then smiled. "Ah, creativity. Yes, I can see how that might be helpful. The Lord works in mysterious ways, they say, and sometimes he inspires us to find solutions we might not have considered before." The priest's words carried a subtle blessing, and Thomas felt a weight lift from his shoulders. While Brother Marcus clearly suspected that Thomas was doing more than simply being creative, he was choosing to interpret it in the best possible light. The priest understood that sometimes survival required flexibility in how rules were followed, and he was offering his tacit approval for whatever Thomas was doing to protect the community. "Indeed," Thomas replied, "I believe we're called to use whatever talents we have to care for our community." "Wise words," Brother Marcus agreed. "And speaking of community, I've noticed that Lord Aldrich seems quite pleased with his new bread deliveries. I understand he's even mentioned them to visiting nobles, praising the sophistication of his local baker." This news both thrilled and terrified Thomas. If Lord Aldrich was talking about the bread to other nobles, it meant the deception was working perfectly. But it also meant that word might spread, potentially attracting unwanted attention or scrutiny. The last thing Thomas wanted was for his methods to be examined too closely by people who might have more sophisticated knowledge of baking techniques. "I'm honored that my humble work meets with approval," Thomas said diplomatically. "Humble indeed," Brother Marcus chuckled, "though I suspect there's more skill involved than humility might suggest." As autumn deepened into winter, Thomas's routine became as natural as breathing. He rose each morning in the darkness, his body automatically knowing the time without need for timepieces. The familiar tasks of lighting the fire, preparing the dough, timing the baking, all of this flowed with a rhythm that connected him to generations of bakers before him. But there were challenges beyond the physical demands of the work. Maintaining two different types of bread required careful resource management. Thomas had to calculate exactly how much flour to use for each type, ensuring that he always had enough for both the castle and village bread without having obvious surplus that might raise questions. He developed a complex mental accounting system, tracking not just the quantities of ingredients, but their timing and usage patterns. The castle bread, being lighter, actually used less flour per loaf than the dense village bread, but it required more expensive additions like honey and herbs. The village bread was more economical in terms of special ingredients, but demanded larger quantities of basic materials. Thomas also had to vary his delivery schedule carefully. Lord Aldrich expected bread every other day, but Thomas couldn't deliver at exactly the same time each visit. That might seem too calculated, too precise for a simple village baker who was supposedly just trying to meet demands as best he could. Instead, he varied his arrival time based on plausible reasons. The fire taking longer to heat properly on cold mornings, a particularly difficult batch of dough that needed extra attention, or simply the natural variations in baking time that any honest baker might experience. The villagers, meanwhile, had adapted to the new reality with the resilience that characterized medieval life. They understood that bread would be available at different times now, and they adjusted their own routines accordingly. Some families began buying 2 days' worth of bread at once, while others developed new ways to make their portions last longer. Mary the seamstress became particularly helpful in this regard. She began organizing informal sharing networks among the families, ensuring that households with more bread could discreetly help those who were struggling. It was community cooperation at its finest, all built around supporting Thomas's careful deception without directly acknowledging what he was doing. These sharing networks operated through subtle signals and unspoken agreements. A family with extra bread might leave a loaf on their windowsill, where a neighbor who needed it could quietly collect it. Children might be sent to play at houses where they would casually be offered food. Women might gather for sewing circles where the real purpose was redistributing resources based on need. Old William the shepherd, with his weathered wisdom, summed up the village's attitude one evening, as Thomas was closing his bakery. "Son, I don't know exactly what you're doing, and I don't need to know. What I do know is that my grandchildren are eating well, Lord Aldrich isn't complaining, and you're managing to keep everyone happy. That takes more than just good baking. That takes good thinking." The old man's words warmed Thomas more than any praise for his bread ever had. This wasn't just about baking anymore. It was about using his skills and intelligence to protect his community, to find a way for everyone to thrive despite difficult circumstances. As winter settled over Little Thornbury, bringing shorter days and longer nights, Thomas found a deep satisfaction in his work that went beyond mere professional pride. Every morning, as he shaped the dough that would feed both castle and village, he was actively choosing compassion over compliance, creativity over capitulation. The snow began to fall gently outside his bakery windows, covering the village in peaceful white. Inside, the oven radiated warmth, and the smell of baking bread promised another day of quiet victory against hunger and despair. The deception continued, growing stronger and more refined with each passing day, protecting not just Thomas's livelihood but the welfare of an entire community. Thomas had found his way to resist oppression without violence, to protect his neighbors without confrontation, to use his skills not just to make a living, but to make life better for everyone around him. And in the growing twilight of the winter evening, as he prepared his final loaves of the day, Thomas allowed himself a moment of quiet pride in what he had accomplished. The yeasty smell of rising dough, the satisfying rhythm of creation. For the castle bread, Thomas had refined his technique even further. He discovered that by adding a small amount of honey and using a slightly different kneading method, he could create loaves that were not only lighter, but also had a subtle sweetness that Lord Aldrich particularly enjoyed. The honey was expensive. Thomas had to trade some of his regular bread to the local beekeeper for it, but it was worth the cost to maintain the illusion of luxury. The village bread, meanwhile, had evolved too. With practice, Thomas found ways to make his traditional loaves even more nutritious and filling. He began incorporating small amounts of barley and oats when he could get them, creating bread that was perhaps simpler in appearance than the castle loaves, but far superior in sustaining power. The villagers, initially worried about how Thomas was managing to fulfill Lord Aldrich's demands while still providing for them, gradually relaxed as they realized their baker had somehow found a solution. They didn't ask too many questions. In medieval times, it was often safer not to know exactly how problems were being solved, especially when those solutions might involve outwitting the local lord. Brother Marcus, however, was more observant. One morning, as he stopped by the bakery for his daily loaf, he watched Thomas working with his usual careful attention. "Thomas, my friend," the priest said gently, "I can't help but notice that you seem to be working much harder these days, yet you're somehow managing to keep everyone fed. Should I ask how you're accomplishing this miracle?" Thomas paused in his kneading, considering his response. Brother Marcus was not only a friend but also the spiritual guide of the village. Thomas trusted him, but he also knew that the priest's position required him to maintain certain loyalties to both the villagers and the church hierarchy, which had its own complex relationship with the nobility. "I've simply been creative with my baking techniques," Thomas said carefully, "finding ways to make the most of what we have." Brother Marcus studied Thomas's face for a moment, then smiled. "Ah, creativity. Yes, I can see how that might be helpful. The Lord works in mysterious ways, they say, and sometimes he inspires us to find solutions we might not have considered before." The priest's words carried a subtle blessing, and Thomas felt a weight lift from his shoulders. While Brother Marcus clearly suspected that Thomas was doing more than simply being creative, he was choosing to interpret it in the best possible light. "Indeed," Thomas replied, "I believe we're called to use whatever talents we have to care for our community." "Wise words," Brother Marcus agreed. "And speaking of community, I've noticed that Lord Aldrich seems quite pleased with his new bread deliveries. I understand he's even mentioned them to visiting nobles, praising the sophistication of his local baker." This news both thrilled and terrified Thomas. If Lord Aldrich was talking about the bread to other nobles, it meant the deception was working perfectly. But it also meant that word might spread, potentially attracting unwanted attention or scrutiny. "I'm honored that my humble work meets with approval," Thomas said diplomatically. "Humble indeed," Brother Marcus chuckled, "though I suspect there's more skill involved than humility might suggest." As autumn deepened into winter, Thomas's routine became as natural as breathing. He rose each morning in the darkness, his body automatically knowing the time without need for timepieces. The familiar tasks of lighting the fire, preparing the dough, timing the baking, all of this flowed with a rhythm that connected him to generations of bakers before him. But there were challenges beyond the physical demands of the work. Maintaining two different types of bread required careful resource management. Thomas had to calculate exactly how much flour to use for each type, ensuring that he always had enough for both the castle and village bread without having obvious surplus that might raise questions. He also had to vary his delivery schedule carefully. Lord Aldrich expected bread every other day, but Thomas couldn't deliver at exactly the same time each visit. That might seem too calculated. Instead, he varied his arrival time based on plausible reasons. The fire taking longer to heat properly on cold mornings, a particularly difficult batch of dough that needed extra attention, or simply the natural variations in baking time that any honest baker might experience. The villagers, meanwhile, had adapted to the new reality with the resilience that characterized medieval life. They understood that bread would be available at different times now, and they adjusted their own routines accordingly. Some families began buying 2 days' worth of bread at once, while others developed new ways to make their portions last longer. Mary the seamstress became particularly helpful in this regard. She began organizing informal sharing networks among the families, ensuring that households with more bread could discreetly help those who were struggling. It was community cooperation at its finest, all built around supporting Thomas's careful deception. Old William the Shepherd, with his weathered wisdom, summed up the village's attitude one evening as Thomas was closing his bakery. "Son, I don't know exactly what you're doing, and I don't need to know. What I do know is that my grandchildren are eating well, Lord Aldrich isn't complaining, and you're managing to keep everyone happy. That takes more than just good baking. That takes good thinking." The old man's words warmed Thomas more than any praise for his bread ever had. This wasn't just about baking anymore. It was about using his skills and intelligence to protect his community, to find a way for everyone to thrive despite difficult circumstances. As winter settled over Little Thornbury, bringing shorter days and longer nights, Thomas found a deep satisfaction in his work that went beyond mere professional pride. Every morning, as he shaped the dough that would feed both castle and village, he was actively choosing compassion over compliance, creativity over capitulation. The snow began to fall gently outside his bakery windows, covering the village in peaceful white. Inside, the oven radiated warmth, and the smell of baking bread promised another day of quiet victory against hunger and despair. Thomas had found his way to resist oppression without violence, to protect his neighbors without confrontation, to use his skills not just to make a living, but to make life better for everyone around him. And in the growing twilight of the winter evening, as he prepared his final loaves of the day, Thomas allowed himself a moment of quiet pride in what he had accomplished. Winter in Little Thornbury was a time of drawing inward, of communities pulling closer together against the cold. The houses seemed smaller and more precious when snow outlined their thatched roofs and icicles hung like crystalline decorations from the eaves. Smoke rose straight up from chimneys in the still air, and the fields lay peaceful under their white blanket, waiting for spring's return. For Thomas, winter brought both challenges and unexpected opportunities. The cold made his early morning work more difficult. The bakery took longer to warm up, and his hands grew stiff as he worked with the dough. But winter also brought a kind of cocoon-like intimacy to the village. People lingered longer around his warm ovens, sharing news and gossip, creating an informal gathering place that became the heart of the community. Lord Aldrich's demands continued unchanged, but Thomas had noticed that the Lord seemed even more pleased with his bread deliveries during the cold months. The warm, golden loaves were a welcome sight in the drafty castle, and their sophisticated appearance provided a bright spot during the gray winter days. "My guests last week were quite impressed with our local delicacies," Lord Aldrich mentioned during one delivery, referring to the pain de chateau with obvious pride. Lord Geoffrey from the neighboring county asked specifically about our baker. "Apparently, word of your French techniques has spread." Thomas felt a flutter of nervousness at this news. Increased attention was the last thing he wanted, but he maintained his humble demeanor. "I'm honored that my simple work brings credit to your lordship's domain." "Indeed it does," Lord Aldrich agreed. "In fact, I'm considering requesting additional loaves for our Christmas feast, something special to impress our guests." Christmas was still several weeks away, but Thomas's mind immediately began working on the challenge. A special feast would require bread that was even more impressive than his usual castle loaves, but he couldn't afford to use significantly more resources, or he wouldn't be able to maintain his village bread production. "I would be honored to create something special for such an important occasion, my lord," Thomas replied. "Perhaps I could prepare a selection of different French-style breads, each with its own unique character?" The idea came to him even as he spoke. Instead of making larger quantities of bread, he could make smaller loaves, but in several different varieties. It would actually be more economical in terms of ingredients, but would appear far more lavish and sophisticated. "Excellent idea," Lord Aldrich said enthusiastically. "A selection of refined breads would certainly impress our guests. How many varieties could you prepare?" "Perhaps 4 or 5 different types, my lord, each one representing a different regional style from France." Thomas was improvising freely now, but his years of experimentation had given him confidence in his ability to create variations in taste and appearance. Over the following weeks, Thomas threw himself into developing his Christmas collection. He experimented with different herbs, rosemary from the monastery garden, thyme that grew wild on the hillsides, even a precious pinch of imported sage that Brother Marcus provided from the church's stores. He tried different shaping techniques, creating some loaves that were braided, others that were formed into decorative spirals. Each evening, after finishing his regular baking, Thomas would work on perfecting these special breads. The warm bakery became his laboratory, and the winter nights his time for creativity. He found the work deeply satisfying. It engaged both his practical skills and his artistic instincts in ways that routine baking, however competent, never had. The villagers watched his experiments with interest and growing excitement. Even though these fancy breads were destined for the castle, there was pride in knowing that their local baker was creating something truly special. Mary suggested that Thomas try incorporating some of the dried flowers she used for dyeing cloth, and the resulting lavender-scented loaves were so beautiful they looked almost too precious to eat. Old William contributed in his own way, sharing his knowledge of which wild herbs were safe to eat and which ones might add interesting flavors. Young Peter from the blacksmith shop helped Thomas create new tools, decorative stamps that could be pressed into the dough to create patterns, and specialized knives for making intricate cuts in the bread's surface. What emerged from these collaborative efforts was something none of them had expected. Thomas wasn't just creating fancy bread for Lord Aldrich anymore. He was creating art. Each loaf became a small masterpiece, beautiful to look at and delicious to taste. The work brought out the best in everyone involved, turning what had begun as a deception into a genuine expression of creativity and community pride. As Christmas approached, Thomas felt ready for his biggest test yet. But he also felt something else, a quiet confidence that came not just from technical skill, but from the knowledge that his entire village was supporting him in this endeavor. The night before the Christmas feast, Thomas worked by candlelight to prepare his special selection. 5 different varieties of bread, each one perfect in its own way. A rosemary spiral that filled the bakery with its piney fragrance, braided loaves studded with dried berries that gleamed like jewels, round loaves decorated with intricate patterns pressed into their golden crusts, and his masterpiece, a large celebration loaf shaped like a star, its points perfectly symmetrical, its surface glazed to a warm honey color. As he placed the finished breads carefully in his delivery baskets, wrapping each one in his finest cloths, Thomas felt a deep satisfaction. Whatever happened tomorrow, he had done his best work. More than that, he had proven to himself that even under pressure, even when forced to be deceptive, it was possible to create something beautiful and meaningful. The winter wind whistled softly around the bakery as Thomas banked his fire for the night. Tomorrow would bring the ultimate test of his skills and his plan. But tonight, surrounded by the fruits of his labor and the warmth of his craft, Thomas felt at peace. He had found a way to turn necessity into art, oppression into opportunity, and fear into something approaching joy. And in the morning, Lord Aldrich's Christmas guests would taste not just bread, but the accumulated skill, creativity, and love of an entire village working together. As Thomas finally made his way to his small cottage, the snow crunching softly under his feet, he looked up at the star-filled winter sky and whispered a prayer of gratitude. Whatever tomorrow brought, tonight had been enough. Christmas morning in Little Thornbury dawned clear and cold, with a fresh dusting of snow that made the entire village look like something from a winter tale. The church bells rang out across the valley, calling the faithful to morning prayers, their bronze voices carrying far in the crisp air. Thomas had barely slept, not from anxiety, but from anticipation. His special Christmas breads sat ready in their baskets, each one wrapped with care, waiting for their moment of presentation. As he prepared for the journey to the castle, he felt a calm certainty that he had done everything possible to make this day a success. The walk to Lord Aldrich's castle seemed different on this Christmas morning. Other villagers were making their way to church, calling out Christmas greetings to each other, their breath visible in small white puffs. Children ran ahead of their parents, excited by the holiday and the fresh snow. It was a day when even the hardships of medieval life seemed temporarily forgotten in favor of celebration and community. At the castle, Thomas found unusual activity. Guests had arrived for the Christmas feast, nobles from neighboring domains, their horses filling the courtyard, their colorful banners adding bright spots of color against the gray stone walls. Servants hurried back and forth, preparing for what was clearly intended to be an impressive celebration. Edgar the guard met Thomas at the gate with an unusually broad smile. "Thomas, perfect timing. Lord Aldrich has been asking about you all morning. He's quite excited about your special Christmas breads." Thomas followed Edgar through the busy courtyard, noting how much more alive the castle felt today. Musicians were tuning their instruments in one corner, while servants decorated the main hall with evergreen boughs and holly. The smell of roasting meat drifted from the kitchens, mixing with the scent of mulled wine and spices. In the main hall, Lord Aldrich was holding court with his guests, but he immediately turned when he saw Thomas arrive. "Ah, here's our master baker," Lord Aldrich announced, his voice carrying clearly across the hall. "Gentlemen, you're about to witness the finest example of French baking techniques this side of Paris." Thomas felt a momentary flutter of nervousness as all eyes turned toward him, but he drew strength from the knowledge of what lay in his baskets. Whatever these noble guests were expecting, he was confident that his Christmas breads would exceed their expectations. "My lord," Thomas said with a respectful bow, "I'm honored to present your Christmas selection." With careful ceremony, Thomas began unwrapping his breads. The first gasp of appreciation came when he revealed the rosemary spiral, its golden surface gleaming, the herb's fragrance immediately filling the air around them. But as he continued, unwrapping each variety in turn, the expressions of genuine amazement on the faces of Lord Aldrich's guests told Thomas that his long nights of experimentation had been worth every moment. The berry-studded braids drew particular attention from the ladies present, their jewel-like fruit creating patterns that were almost too beautiful to eat. The decoratively stamped round loaves prompted questions about the technique, with several guests examining the intricate patterns pressed into the golden crusts. But when Thomas finally unveiled his masterpiece, the star-shaped celebration loaf with its perfect symmetry and honey glaze, a moment of complete silence fell over the hall. "Magnificent," breathed Lord Geoffrey, the neighboring lord who had originally asked about Thomas's techniques. "I've seen the finest bakers in London, but nothing quite like this. The artistry is remarkable." Lord Aldrich positively beamed with pride. "As I mentioned, we have quite exceptional local talent here. Thomas has been studying the most advanced French techniques specifically for our table." Thomas maintained his humble expression while inwardly marveling at how completely his deception had succeeded. These sophisticated nobles, who had presumably tasted the finest foods available in medieval England, were genuinely impressed by bread that had been created in a simple village bakery using local ingredients and traditional techniques, just applied with creativity and care. "The star design," observed Lady Margaret, Lord Geoffrey's wife. "Is it symbolic of the Christmas star?" Thomas hadn't actually intended any religious symbolism, but he recognized an opportunity to add to the story. "Indeed, my lady. In the French tradition, Christmas breads often incorporate celestial themes to honor the star that guided the wise men." "How beautifully thoughtful," she replied, clearly charmed by the explanation. The tasting that followed was perhaps the most nerve-wracking moment of Thomas's entire deception. These were people accustomed to the finest foods, people who might easily detect that his sophisticated French techniques were actually variations on traditional English baking methods. But as Thomas watched the guests sample each variety of bread, their expressions of genuine pleasure told him that his gamble had paid off completely. The breads were not just acceptable, they were genuinely excellent. All his experimentation, all his careful attention to flavors and textures, had resulted in creations that stood on their own merit, regardless of the stories he had crafted around them. "The herb combinations are inspired," commented Sir Robert, a guest from a distant county. "And the texture, how do you achieve such lightness while maintaining such rich flavor?" "Trade secrets of the French masters, I'm afraid," Thomas replied diplomatically. "Techniques passed down through generations of guild bakers." Lord Aldrich looked as proud as if he had baked the bread himself. "We're quite fortunate to have such skilled craftsmen in our domain. It speaks well of the quality of our local training, don't you think?" The other nobles agreed enthusiastically, and Thomas realized that his success was reflecting well not just on him, but on Lord Aldrich's entire lordship. This was better than he had dared hope. His deception was actually enhancing Lord Aldrich's reputation among his peers. As the formal presentation concluded and the guests moved on to other holiday activities, Lord Aldrich drew Thomas aside. "Exceptional work today, Thomas," the Lord said quietly. "I believe this will be remembered as one of our finest Christmas celebrations. Your contribution has been significant." "I'm honored to serve your lordship," Thomas replied. "I'm planning to increase the regular bread deliveries," Lord Aldrich continued. "With such quality available, it seems foolish not to take advantage of it more frequently." Thomas's heart sank. More frequent deliveries would strain his carefully balanced system, making it much harder to maintain both castle and village bread production. "Of course, my lord," Thomas said carefully, "though I should mention that maintaining this level of quality requires considerable time and attention. Perhaps we could discuss a schedule that ensures the highest possible standards?" Lord Aldrich nodded thoughtfully. "Naturally. Quality cannot be rushed. Shall we say 3 times per week instead of twice? That should give you adequate time for proper preparation while providing us with more regular access to your excellent work." It was a compromise Thomas could live with, though it would mean even longer working days. But as he walked back through the snowy village that Christmas afternoon, his empty basket swinging at his side, Thomas felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond mere relief at another successful deception. The villagers were returning from Christmas services at the church, their faces bright with holiday joy. Children ran through the snow, their laughter echoing off the cottage walls. Families gathered around their fires, sharing simple meals that were made more precious by the warmth of community and celebration. Thomas realized that his Christmas triumph at the castle was only half the story. The real victory was here in the village, where families had enough bread to celebrate the holiday properly, where children could sleep with full stomachs, where the community remained strong and intact, despite the pressures placed upon it. That evening, as was traditional on Christmas night, the villagers gathered in the main square for caroling and fellowship. Thomas found himself surrounded by neighbors who knew, without needing to be told, that his morning's work at the castle had somehow secured their continued well-being. "Beautiful night," Brother Marcus observed, joining Thomas near the edge of the gathering. "Indeed it is," Thomas agreed, looking up at the star-filled sky. "I imagine Lord Aldrich's guests were quite impressed with your Christmas presentation," the priest said gently. "They seemed pleased," Thomas replied diplomatically. Brother Marcus chuckled softly. "I'm sure they were. It takes considerable skill to create something that satisfies both sophisticated palates and simple needs simultaneously." Thomas glanced at the priest, wondering exactly how much Brother Marcus understood about his methods. But the older man's expression was serene, his eyes focused on the children playing in the snow. "The Lord provides," Brother Marcus continued, "often through the hands and hearts of those who are willing to use their gifts in service of others." "Amen to that," Thomas said quietly. As the evening deepened and the villagers gradually dispersed to their homes, Thomas made his way back to his bakery. Tomorrow would bring the usual challenges: maintaining his deception, managing his increased workload, ensuring that both castle and village remained satisfied with their bread. But tonight, Christmas night, Thomas allowed himself to simply appreciate what had been accomplished. Through creativity and determination, through the support of his community and perhaps a bit of divine providence, he had found a way to protect his neighbors while satisfying his Lord's demands. The bakery felt especially warm and welcoming as Thomas banked his fire for the night. The lingering aromas of the day's baking, rosemary, honey, the yeasty comfort of fresh bread, filled the air like a blessing. Outside, the snow continued to fall softly, covering Little Thornbury in peaceful silence. Inside, Thomas prepared for sleep with the quiet satisfaction of work well done and challenges successfully met. His gentle rebellion continued, one loaf at a time, one day at a time, protecting his community through the simple but profound act of feeding them well. And in the morning, the cycle would begin again. The eternal rhythm of baker's work, now elevated into something approaching art by necessity, creativity, and love. Winter gradually loosened its grip on Little Thornbury as the weeks following Christmas passed in their quiet, measured way. The snow that had blanketed the village on Christmas morning slowly melted, revealing the brown earth beneath and the first tentative green shoots of plants awakening from their winter sleep. For Thomas, the rhythm of his double life had become as natural as breathing. The increased deliveries to the castle, now 3 times per week instead of 2, had indeed required longer working days, but he had adapted with the flexibility that comes from years of practice. He rose even earlier now, sometimes beginning his work while the stars were still bright in the sky, and he often worked by candlelight well into the evening. But spring brought its own rewards. The longer days meant more natural light for his detailed work, and the warming weather made the early morning hours in the bakery more comfortable. More importantly, spring meant that fresh ingredients would soon be available again: wild herbs emerging from the forest floor, early vegetables from the village gardens, and eventually, the promise of a new harvest. The villagers had settled completely into the new routine. They understood that bread would be available at certain times and in certain quantities, and they had organized themselves accordingly with the quiet efficiency that marked all aspects of medieval community life. The sharing networks that Mary had established had become formalized into a system where families with larger households could get additional bread, while elderly couples who needed less could ensure that their portions went to those who needed them most. Thomas found deep satisfaction in watching this community cooperation flourish. His deception had not only protected the village from hunger, but had actually strengthened the bonds between families as they worked together to make the most of their resources. One particularly mild morning in early March, as Thomas was preparing his castle delivery, Brother Marcus stopped by the bakery with news from the wider world. "I've received word from the monastery at Whitby," the priest said, settling onto the wooden stool that Thomas kept near the oven for visitors. "Apparently, Lord Aldrich's Christmas feast has become quite famous among the regional nobility. Several lords have written requesting information about our local French baker and his techniques." Thomas paused in his work, a flutter of concern running through him. Fame was the last thing he wanted for his deception. "I see," Thomas said carefully. "And what sort of information are they seeking?" "Oh, nothing too specific," Brother Marcus replied with a slight smile. Mostly just asking if Lord Aldrich might be willing to share his baker for special occasions, or whether you might be available to train their own bakers in these sophisticated techniques. The idea of being loaned out to other castles to perpetuate his deception filled Thomas with horror. One thing to maintain his story within the familiar confines of his own village and Lord Aldrich's castle, quite another to carry it into unknown territory where he might encounter people with actual knowledge of French baking techniques. I hope Lord Aldrich explained that my techniques are quite specialized for local conditions, Thomas said diplomatically. Indeed he did, Brother Marcus chuckled. Told them that you've spent years adapting traditional French methods to work with local ingredients and conditions, and that your skills might not translate well to other regions. Very protective of his local resources, our Lord Aldrich. Thomas felt a wave of relief. Lord Aldrich's possessiveness, usually a source of difficulty for the village, had actually worked in Thomas's favor this time. However, Brother Marcus continued, there is one development you should know about. Lord Geoffrey has invited Lord Aldrich to a grand feast at Easter and specifically requested that you provide bread for the occasion. Lord Aldrich has apparently agreed. This was more problematic. Providing bread for a feast at another castle would require Thomas to transport his creations over a considerable distance, maintain their quality during travel, and present them in unfamiliar surroundings where he couldn't control the narrative as carefully. I see, Thomas said slowly. And when is this Easter feast to take place? 3 weeks hence. Lord Aldrich mentioned that he would like you to prepare an even more impressive selection than you created for Christmas, something that will demonstrate the full extent of your expertise. Thomas spent the rest of that day thinking about the challenge ahead. An Easter feast for multiple nobles would require breads that were not only delicious and beautiful, but also capable of surviving a several-hour journey by cart without losing their appeal. It would also require him to maintain his deception in front of an audience that might include people with broader culinary experience than Lord Aldrich's usual guests. But as he worked through the technical problems, Thomas found himself becoming excited rather than worried. The challenge was significant, but it was also an opportunity to push his skills even further, to create something truly remarkable that would stand on its own merit regardless of the stories surrounding it. Over the following days, Thomas threw himself into preparation with renewed energy. He experimented with ways to make his breads more portable, developing a technique for creating decorative glazes that would actually protect the bread during transport rather than just making it look attractive. He worked on new flavor combinations, incorporating some of the early spring herbs that were beginning to appear in the countryside. The villagers watched his preparations with growing excitement and pride. Word had somehow spread that their baker was going to represent Little Thornbury at a grand feast, and the entire community felt invested in his success. Old William brought early wild garlic from the forest. Mary contributed some of her finest linen for wrapping the finished breads. Young Peter crafted specialized carrying cases that would protect the more delicate creations during the journey. Even the children became involved, helping to gather the perfect stones for creating decorative impressions in the bread crusts, and collecting early spring flowers that could be used for both decoration and subtle flavoring. As Easter approached, Thomas realized that what had begun as a solitary deception had transformed into a community project. The entire village was now collaborating to help their baker create something extraordinary, not because they knew the full details of his story, but because they trusted him and wanted to see him succeed. The night before the Easter feast, Thomas worked until nearly dawn, putting the finishing touches on his most ambitious bread collection yet. 6 different varieties, each one representing a different aspect of spring's renewal. Herb breads twisted into shapes that resembled growing vines. Sweetbreads studded with early berries and shaped like nests. A centerpiece loaf decorated with intricate patterns that suggested the renewal of life after winter's sleep. As he carefully packed each creation for the journey ahead, Thomas felt a calm confidence that surprised him. He had done his best work, supported by his entire community. Whatever happened at Lord Geoffrey's feast, he could face it knowing that he had honored both his craft and his neighbors' trust. The morning sun was just beginning to rise as Thomas loaded his precious cargo into the cart that would carry him to the Easter feast. The villagers had gathered to see him off, their faces bright with pride and anticipation. "Bring honor to Little Thornbury," old William called out. "As if he could do anything else," Mary replied with a smile. As the cart rolled out of the village toward Lord Geoffrey's castle, Thomas felt the weight of his community's hopes and trust. But he also felt something else, a quiet joy in his work that went beyond fear or deception. He was carrying not just bread to this feast, but the accumulated skill, creativity, and love of an entire village. And that, Thomas thought as the familiar countryside rolled past, was a gift worthy of any lord's table. The journey to Lord Geoffrey's castle took most of the morning, the cart rolling steadily along roads that were muddy from spring rains but passable. Thomas rode beside the driver, a young man from Lord Aldrich's stable who had been chosen for his steady handling of horses and his discretion. The precious cargo of Easter breads traveled in specially constructed boxes that protected them from the worst jolts and bumps of the journey. As they traveled, Thomas found himself in an unexpectedly contemplative mood. The countryside was waking up from winter in the most beautiful way, trees showing the first pale green of new leaves, fields dotted with wildflowers, streams running full and clear from melted snow. It was a landscape that spoke of renewal and possibility, themes that seemed especially appropriate for Easter. Lord Geoffrey's castle, when it finally came into view, was considerably larger and more impressive than Lord Aldrich's modest keep. Multiple towers rose against the spring sky, and the stone walls were decorated with carved details that spoke of greater wealth and longer establishment. The courtyard they entered was bustling with activity as servants prepared for what was clearly intended to be a magnificent celebration. Thomas was directed to the kitchens, where he met the head cook, a formidable woman named Margaret, who had clearly been in charge of feast preparations for many years. She examined Thomas's bread boxes with the sharp eye of someone accustomed to evaluating quality. "So, you're the famous French baker we've been hearing about," she said, though her tone was more curious than challenging. "Lord Aldrich has been quite proud of your work. Let's see what all the fuss is about." Thomas carefully unpacked his Easter collection, revealing each variety with the same care he had used at Christmas. Margaret's expressions of appreciation were more restrained than those of the nobles had been, but Thomas could see genuine professional admiration in her eyes as she examined his craftsmanship. "Beautiful work," she admitted grudgingly. "The technique on these twisted herb breads is particularly impressive. How do you achieve that pattern without tearing the dough?" Thomas found himself engaged in the first honest conversation about baking technique he had had in months. Margaret was clearly a master of her own craft, and her questions were informed and insightful. For a few minutes, Thomas forgot about deception and simply enjoyed talking shop with someone who understood the challenges and satisfactions of professional baking. "You've got real skill," Margaret concluded after examining all the breads. "Whatever training you've had, French or otherwise, you've made good use of it." There was something in the way she said, "French or otherwise," that made Thomas look at her more carefully. Margaret met his gaze with a slight smile that suggested she might understand more about his situation than she was letting on. "Experience is the best teacher," Thomas replied diplomatically. "Indeed it is," Margaret agreed. "And creativity born of necessity can produce remarkable results." Before Thomas could fully process the implications of this comment, Lord Aldrich arrived in the kitchen, accompanied by Lord Geoffrey and several other guests who had come to see the famous bread collection before the feast began. "Magnificent as always, Thomas," Lord Aldrich said proudly as he surveyed the display. "Gentlemen, observe the artistry in these Easter creations. The twisted herb breads alone represent hours of skilled work." Lord Geoffrey examined the breads with obvious appreciation, but Thomas noticed that his attention seemed focused more on the technical execution than on the supposed French origins of the techniques. "Remarkable craftsmanship," Lord Geoffrey agreed. "The flavor combinations are quite sophisticated. Tell me, Thomas, where exactly in France did you learn these particular methods?" Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. This was the question he had been dreading, a direct inquiry that required a specific answer rather than vague allusions to French techniques. "I learned from traveling bakers, my lord," Thomas replied carefully. "Craftsmen who had worked in various regions of France and brought different techniques with them when they passed through our area." "Ah, yes," Lord Geoffrey nodded. "The traveling guilds. They do tend to blend techniques from different regions. That would explain the interesting combination of styles I see in your work." Thomas breathed an internal sigh of relief. Lord Geoffrey's interpretation of his vague answer had actually been more specific and believable than anything Thomas could have invented. The feast itself was a magnificent affair, Thomas's breads were presented as a special course, with each variety explained and praised by Lord Aldrich. The guests' responses were everything Thomas could have hoped for. Genuine appreciation for the flavors and artistry, along with compliments to Lord Aldrich for securing such skilled local talent. But the real test came during a quiet moment later in the evening, when Thomas was helping Margaret and her staff with the final cleanup. Lord Geoffrey approached him privately, away from the other guests, and from Lord Aldrich. "Thomas," Lord Geoffrey said quietly, "I wanted to speak with you about your baking techniques." Thomas felt a surge of nervousness. A private conversation with an unfamiliar noble could go in any direction. "Of course, my lord. How may I assist you?" "I've been watching your work today, and I've tasted everything you prepared," Lord Geoffrey continued. "The quality is exceptional, truly remarkable. But I'm curious about something." Thomas waited, his heart pounding. "I spent several years in France as a young man," Lord Geoffrey said. "I'm quite familiar with the baking techniques used in most regions. What you've created today is excellent work, but it's not particularly French in style. It's something else entirely, something that might be even more valuable." Thomas felt the world shift around him. He had been discovered, but Lord Geoffrey's tone didn't sound accusatory. If anything, he seemed pleased. "I'm not sure I understand, my lord," Thomas said carefully. Lord Geoffrey smiled. "What you've done is take traditional English baking methods and elevated them through innovation and artistry. You've created something new and beautiful without needing to imitate foreign techniques. That takes considerable skill and confidence." Thomas stared at the Lord, unsure how to respond. Was this a trap? A test? "My lord, Thomas began, but Lord Geoffrey held up a hand. "I'm not here to expose or embarrass anyone," Lord Geoffrey said gently. "Lord Aldrich is clearly proud of having you in his domain, and he should be. What I'm curious about is whether you might be interested in something more than just providing bread for occasional feasts." "What do you mean, my lord?" "I'm planning to establish a new kind of enterprise," Lord Geoffrey explained. "A workshop where skilled craftsmen can develop and perfect their techniques without the usual constraints of guild regulations or local traditions. A place where innovation is valued over convention." Thomas felt a mixture of excitement and confusion. "That sounds ambitious, my lord." "It is ambitious," Lord Geoffrey agreed, "and it would require craftsmen who are willing to think beyond traditional methods, who can create quality work, regardless of what stories might be told about its origins." The conversation was interrupted by the return of other guests, but Lord Geoffrey's words stayed with Thomas throughout the remainder of the evening and during the journey back to Little Thornbury the next day. As the familiar sights of his home village came into view, Thomas found himself contemplating possibilities he had never considered before. His deception had begun as a desperate attempt to protect his community, but it had led him to discover capabilities he hadn't known he possessed. The villagers gathered to welcome him home, eager to hear about the feast and how their bread had been received. As Thomas described the evening's success, seeing the pride and joy in his neighbors' faces, he realized that whatever opportunities might await him elsewhere, his deepest satisfaction came from serving this community that had supported him through everything. But Lord Geoffrey's words had planted a seed of possibility. Perhaps there were ways to grow and develop his craft without abandoning his responsibilities to Little Thornbury. Perhaps the skills he had developed through necessity could open doors he had never imagined. As evening fell over the village and Thomas returned to his familiar bakery, he felt a deep contentment mixed with quiet excitement about the future. His gentle rebellion had succeeded beyond his wildest hopes, but it had also revealed new horizons that stretched far beyond the simple goal of keeping his community fed. The oven radiated its familiar warmth, and the smell of tomorrow's bread already beginning to rise filled the air with promise. Whatever came next, Thomas knew he would face it with the confidence that comes from having successfully protected those he cared about, and the knowledge that his skills were valued far beyond his village's borders. Outside, the spring evening settled peacefully over Little Thornbury, and inside his bakery, Thomas prepared for another day of quiet miracles, the daily transformation of simple ingredients into sustenance, comfort, and hope. Summer arrived gently in Little Thornbury, bringing longer days and the promise of a good harvest. The fields around the village were green with growing grain, and the gardens were producing their first vegetables. It was a time of abundance after the lean months of winter, and the village had settled into a comfortable rhythm that reflected both prosperity and security. Thomas's routine had evolved into something sustainable and satisfying. The increased deliveries to Lord Aldrich continued, but Thomas had become so efficient at managing both types of bread production that the work no longer felt overwhelming. He had also begun experimenting with seasonal variations, incorporating fresh herbs and vegetables as they became available, creating breads that celebrated the changing seasons while maintaining the high standards that had made his reputation. The relationship with Lord Aldrich had developed into something approaching mutual respect. The Lord continued to take pride in his baker's skills, frequently mentioning the quality of his bread to visitors and correspondents. For his part, Thomas had come to appreciate that Lord Aldrich, while demanding and sometimes unreasonable, was not actively malicious, simply a man trying to maintain his position and lifestyle in difficult times. More importantly, the village was thriving. The success of Thomas's deception had given the community confidence and security that extended far beyond just having enough bread. Families were able to plan for the future, make improvements to their homes, and invest in tools and livestock that would benefit them for years to come. One warm afternoon in late June, as Thomas was preparing his regular castle delivery, Brother Marcus arrived with a letter that bore Lord Geoffrey's seal. "This came with the regular post from the monastery," Brother Marcus explained, handing over the parchment. "I believe it may be related to your Easter visit." Thomas opened the letter with curiosity and some trepidation. Lord Geoffrey's message was brief but significant. "Thomas the baker, I have given considerable thought to our conversation following the Easter feast. The workshop I mentioned is now being established near York. I would be honored to have you join this enterprise as a master craftsman, with full support for your family and appropriate compensation for your skills. If you are interested, please send word. There is no urgency. Good opportunities should be considered carefully." Respectfully, Lord Geoffrey Thomas read the letter twice, then handed it to Brother Marcus, who read it with growing excitement. "This is a remarkable opportunity, Thomas," the priest said. "To be invited to join a lord's enterprise as a master craftsman, it could change your entire future." "It could," Thomas agreed thoughtfully, "but it would also mean leaving Little Thornbury, leaving all of you." Brother Marcus studied Thomas's face carefully. "You're not sure you want to go?" "I'm not sure of anything," Thomas admitted. "A year ago, my biggest concern was having enough flour for the week's baking. Now I'm being offered opportunities I never imagined. It's overwhelming." "May I offer some thoughts?" Brother Marcus asked gently. Thomas nodded. "You've spent this past year proving something important, not just to Lord Aldrich or to visiting nobles, but to yourself. You've discovered that you have skills and creativity that extend far beyond simple bread making. You've also proven that you can protect and serve your community even under difficult circumstances." The priest paused, gathering his thoughts. "But here's what I think you may not have fully realized yet. You haven't just been keeping us fed this past year. You've been showing us what's possible when someone refuses to accept limitations, when someone uses their gifts not just for personal benefit, but for the good of others." Thomas looked puzzled. "I don't understand." "Mary has started teaching other women her needlework techniques, creating beautiful things that she's begun selling to travelers. Old William has been sharing his knowledge of animal husbandry with younger farmers, helping them improve their flocks. Young Peter has invented new tools that are making everyone's work easier." Brother Marcus smiled. "Your example, using creativity and skill to overcome challenges, has inspired others to discover their own capabilities. The whole village is becoming more innovative, more confident." Thomas had noticed these developments but hadn't connected them to his own activities. "So the question isn't really whether you should take Lord Geoffrey's offer," Brother Marcus continued. "The question is, how can you continue to grow and develop your own gifts while still supporting the community that means so much to you?" Over the following days, Thomas found himself thinking deeply about Brother Marcus's words and about Lord Geoffrey's offer. He also began paying closer attention to the changes in the village that the priest had mentioned. Mary was indeed creating beautiful needlework that attracted buyers from neighboring villages. Her success was providing additional income for her family, while also giving her a sense of accomplishment that went beyond simple necessity. Old William had begun holding informal classes for young farmers, teaching techniques that his grandfather had passed down to him. These sessions had become popular gathering points where knowledge was shared and community bonds were strengthened. Young Peter's innovations at the blacksmith shop were not only making local work more efficient, but were beginning to attract attention from other villages. Orders for his improved tools were becoming a significant part of the smith's business. The pattern was clear. Thomas's example of using skill and creativity to solve problems had indeed inspired others to discover and develop their own capabilities. The village was becoming more prosperous and self-confident, better able to handle whatever challenges might arise. This realization helped Thomas understand what he needed to do about Lord Geoffrey's offer. One evening, as he was finishing his day's baking, Thomas sat down to compose his reply to Lord Geoffrey. The letter he wrote was respectful but confident. Lord Geoffrey, I am deeply honored by your invitation and grateful for your confidence in my abilities. Your workshop sounds like a remarkable enterprise that will surely benefit many skilled craftsmen. However, my deepest satisfaction comes from serving my local community, which has supported me through every challenge. I believe I can best develop my skills while continuing this service. If you would welcome occasional collaboration, perhaps special commissions for important occasions, I would be honored to contribute to your workshop's success while remaining based in Little Thornbury. With respect and gratitude, Thomas the Baker. When Brother Marcus read the letter, he smiled broadly. Wise choice, my friend. You've found a way to honor both your ambitions and your loyalties. Thomas sent the letter with the next traveling merchant and received a reply within 2 weeks. Lord Geoffrey expressed understanding and respect for Thomas's decision and formally invited him to contribute to special projects as his time and inclinations allowed. It was exactly the arrangement Thomas had hoped for, opportunities for growth and challenge without abandoning his community responsibilities. As summer deepened into autumn, Thomas found a deep satisfaction in his chosen path. His regular deliveries to Lord Aldrich continued, no longer feeling like deception but simply like good business. The castle received excellent bread that met their standards and expectations, while the village continued to have access to affordable, nourishing food. The seasonal variations Thomas had developed were becoming locally famous. Travelers sometimes stopped in Little Thornbury specifically to sample his autumn breads made with local apples and herbs, or his winter varieties that incorporated preserved fruits and nuts. What had begun as a desperate attempt to outwit an unreasonable demand had evolved into a sustainable way of life that honored both his craft and his community. Thomas had learned that creativity born of necessity could become creativity born of joy, and that protecting others was often the best way to discover one's own potential. As the first cool winds of autumn began to blow across the fields around Little Thornbury, Thomas felt a deep contentment with his place in the world. He had found his way to serve both his craft and his community, to grow as a craftsman while remaining rooted in the place and people that gave his work meaning. The gentle rebellion continued, but it no longer felt like rebellion. It felt like home. The harvest season came to Little Thornbury with golden abundance, the fields surrounding the village heavy with grain that promised a good winter for all. Thomas watched the harvest from his bakery window as he worked, noting how the villagers moved through the fields with confident efficiency. There was no desperation in their work this year, no worry about whether there would be enough to see them through the cold months ahead. This sense of security was perhaps the greatest gift that had emerged from Thomas's year of gentle deception. Not just the immediate benefit of having enough bread, but the deeper confidence that came from knowing their community could adapt and thrive, even under difficult circumstances. The rhythm of Thomas's days had settled into something deeply satisfying. He rose each morning with the familiar pleasure of skilled work awaiting him, work that fed both body and soul. The technical challenges of maintaining 2 different types of bread production had become second nature, freeing his mind to focus on the creative aspects of his craft. His morning routine began in the quiet darkness before dawn, when the world felt most peaceful and full of possibility. The fire would kindle easily now, as if the oven itself had grown accustomed to the daily cycle of warmth and productivity. The dough would rise predictably, each batch slightly different based on the weather, the season, the quality of that week's flour, but all responding to Thomas's practiced hands with reliable consistency. The castle bread continued to evolve and improve. Thomas had developed a repertoire of seasonal variations that kept Lord Aldrich's table interesting without requiring exotic ingredients or enormous additional effort. Spring breads incorporated fresh herbs and early vegetables, Summer loaves featured berries and flowers. Autumn brought apple and nut varieties that filled the castle with warm, welcoming aromas. Winter returned to the sophisticated simplicity that had first established Thomas's reputation. But it was the village bread that brought Thomas his deepest satisfaction. These were the loaves that sustained families, that provided children with the nutrition they needed to grow strong, that gave hard-working adults the energy for their daily labor. This bread required no pretense or elaborate presentation. Its value lay in its fundamental honesty, its ability to nourish and satisfy. Over the months, Thomas had perfected these village loaves to a remarkable degree. They lasted longer than ordinary bread, stayed fresh and flavorful for several days, and provided exceptional nutrition despite using relatively simple ingredients. The secret lay not in exotic additions, but in perfect technique. The right balance of ingredients, the proper fermentation time, the precise heat and timing that transformed simple flour and water into something approaching perfection. The villagers had come to understand and appreciate this quality without needing detailed explanations. They knew that Thomas's bread was something special, that it represented not just sustenance, but care, skill, and dedication to their welfare. This knowledge created a bond between baker and community that went far beyond simple commerce. Mary the seamstress often stopped by the bakery in the early evening when her own work was done and Thomas was preparing his final batches of the day. She would sit on the wooden stool near the oven, sometimes bringing mending work to do by the light of Thomas's oil lamps, sometimes simply talking quietly about the day's events in the village. "Young Peter is courting the miller's daughter," she mentioned one evening, her needle moving steadily through a torn shirt. "They'll make a good match, I think. Both of them clever with their hands, both willing to work hard." Thomas smiled as he shaped loaves for the next morning's baking. It's good to see the young people settling down, planning families. Shows they have confidence in the future. "Indeed it does," Mary agreed. "Though I remember when we were all worried about whether there would be a future to plan for. That seems like a long time ago now." It did seem like a long time, though it had been less than a year since Lord Aldrich's decree had threatened the village's stability. The community had not only survived that challenge, but had grown stronger and more resilient. The shared experience of overcoming difficulty had created bonds that enriched daily life in countless small ways. Old William had become something of a village elder, his years of experience and natural wisdom making him a person that others sought out for advice and guidance. His evening walks through the village had become informal opportunities for neighbors to share concerns, ask questions, or simply enjoy the company of someone who listened well and spoke thoughtfully. Brother Marcus continued his quiet service to the community, but Thomas noticed that the priest's Sunday sermons had taken on a more optimistic tone over the past months. Where once he had spoken primarily of endurance and faith in difficult times, now he talked more often about gratitude, community, and the ways that individuals could contribute to the common good. The children of the village showed perhaps the most dramatic changes. Better fed and living in a more secure environment, they seemed more energetic, more playful, more confident in their interactions with adults. Their laughter could be heard throughout the village, a sound that had been notably absent during the worried months before Thomas's solution had taken effect. Young Peter had indeed become more innovative in his work at the blacksmith shop, but he had also become a natural leader among the village's younger generation. His confidence, built through successful innovation and community recognition, had inspired other young people to explore their own capabilities and ambitions. The seasonal cycle had completed itself and begun again, each turn bringing new understanding and deeper satisfaction. Thomas found that he no longer thought of his work primarily in terms of deception or even problem-solving. Instead, his days felt like a continuous conversation between his skills and his community's needs, with each informing and enriching the other. The autumn evening air carried the scent of wood smoke and harvest plenty as Thomas finished his final preparations for the next day's baking. The dough sat covered and rising slowly, developing the complex flavors that would emerge when it met the oven's heat in the morning. The embers in the oven glowed softly, maintaining just enough warmth to keep the bakery comfortable through the night. This was Thomas's favorite time of day, when the urgent work was complete and the peaceful work of planning and preparation could unfold at its own natural pace. He often used these quiet hours to consider improvements to his techniques, to plan seasonal variations for the coming weeks, or simply to appreciate the deep satisfaction that came from work well done. Tonight, he found his thoughts turning to the broader patterns that had emerged over the past year. What had begun as a crisis, Lord Aldrich's unreasonable demands threatening the village's survival, had ultimately become an opportunity for growth, creativity, and community strengthening. The challenge had revealed capabilities that might otherwise have remained dormant, both in Thomas himself and in the village as a whole. This realization brought with it a sense of wonder at the unpredictable ways that difficulties could transform into blessings. Thomas had not chosen the circumstances that forced him to develop his deception, but he had chosen how to respond to those circumstances. That choice had made all the difference. As he moved around the bakery, tidying tools and preparing for tomorrow's work, Thomas felt the familiar comfort of well-established routine. But beneath that comfort lay a deeper awareness of the creative possibilities that remained open to him. His arrangement with Lord Geoffrey meant that he would occasionally have opportunities to tackle new challenges, to push his skills in directions he had never explored. Yet these future possibilities felt less important than the present moment. The warmth of the bakery, the scent of rising bread, the knowledge that tomorrow would bring another day of feeding his community well. There was something profoundly satisfying about work that connected directly to people's daily needs, work that transformed simple ingredients into sustenance and comfort. The village had grown quiet around him as families settled into their evening routines. Through the bakery windows, Thomas could see the warm glow of oil lamps and candles in cottage windows, and occasionally catch the sound of children's voices as parents told bedtime stories or sang lullabies. This was the world he had chosen to protect and serve, a world of simple pleasures and fundamental securities. Not a grand or glamorous world, but one rich in human connection and daily meaning. Thomas had discovered that protecting this world had taught him more about his own capabilities than any amount of individual ambition might have achieved. Brother Marcus appeared at the bakery door, making his evening rounds through the village as was his custom. The priest often stopped by to share a few quiet words before heading home to the small house beside the church. "Another peaceful evening," Brother Marcus observed, stepping into the warmth of the bakery. "Indeed," Thomas replied, setting aside the towel he had been using to clean his work surface. "The village feels settled, doesn't it? Comfortable in a way it hasn't for years." "It does," the priest agreed. "I've been thinking about that word, settled. It suggests more than just material security, doesn't it? It implies a kind of spiritual rest, a confidence that allows people to focus on growth rather than mere survival." Thomas nodded, understanding the distinction. During the months of uncertainty before his solution had taken effect, the village had felt suspended, its inhabitants unable to plan or dream because their energy was consumed by immediate concerns. Now there was space for the kinds of activities that made life rich and meaningful. Peter's innovations, Mary's artistic needlework, old William's teaching, the young people's courtships and plans for families. "I've been wondering," Brother Marcus continued, "whether you've considered that your year of creative problem-solving might have taught lessons that extend beyond baking." "What do you mean?" Thomas asked, though he suspected he understood the priest's direction. "Well, you've demonstrated that it's possible to meet unreasonable demands without compromising essential values. You've shown that creativity and skill can protect communities when direct resistance might prove dangerous. And you've proven that individual innovation can strengthen rather than weaken communal bonds." Thomas considered these observations carefully. "I'm not sure I set out to demonstrate anything so grand. I was simply trying to keep everyone fed." "Of course," Brother Marcus smiled, "but sometimes the most important lessons emerge from practical action rather than theoretical planning. What you accomplished through necessity might serve as a model for others facing different but equally challenging circumstances." The conversation continued in this philosophical vein for a while, touching on questions of individual responsibility, community welfare, and the ways that ordinary people could navigate the complex demands of their social and political environment. It was the kind of discussion that Brother Marcus particularly enjoyed, and Thomas found himself appreciating the priest's ability to find broader meaning in everyday events. As Brother Marcus prepared to continue his evening rounds, he paused at the bakery door. "Thomas, I hope you realize that what you've accomplished this year extends far beyond solving a temporary crisis. You've helped this community discover its own resilience and creativity. That's a gift that will keep giving long after the current circumstances have changed. After the priest left, Thomas remained in the bakery for a while longer, tending to small tasks that didn't really need immediate attention, but provided a pleasant way to wind down from the day's work. The dough continued its slow rise, transforming gradually from simple ingredients into something complex and nourishing. The process was so familiar now that Thomas barely needed to think about it consciously, yet it never lost its essential mystery and satisfaction. As he finally prepared to leave the bakery for his cottage next door, Thomas took a moment to look around the space that had become the center of his professional and creative life. The stone oven, built by his father and grandfather, radiated gentle warmth. The wooden work surfaces, worn smooth by decades of use, caught the soft light of the oil lamps. The shelves and storage areas, organized with the efficiency that came from years of practice, held everything needed for tomorrow's work. This was more than just a workplace. It was a connection to his family's history and a foundation for his community's future. The skills he practiced here were both ancient and constantly evolving, rooted in tradition but responsive to new challenges and opportunities. Thomas extinguished all but one small lamp, which he would leave burning to provide a gentle warmth through the night and help maintain the perfect environment for the rising dough. As he stepped outside into the cool autumn air, he breathed deeply, savoring the clean scent of approaching night. The cottage that had been his home for his entire adult life felt especially welcoming after the long day. As he settled into his simple wooden chair beside the small fireplace, Thomas reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this point of contentment and confidence. A year ago, he had been a competent but unremarkable village baker, skilled in his trade but limited in his ambitions. The crisis precipitated by Lord Aldrich's demands had forced him to discover capabilities he hadn't known he possessed, to develop creative solutions he had never imagined needing. More importantly, that crisis had revealed the profound satisfaction that came from using his skills not just for personal survival, but for community welfare. The bread he created each day was no longer just a product to be sold. It was a daily act of service, a tangible expression of care for his neighbors' well-being. This realization had transformed not just his work, but his understanding of his place in the world. He was not simply a baker who happened to live in Little Thornbury. He was an integral part of a community that depended on his skills, just as he depended on theirs. The interdependence was not a burden, but a source of strength and meaning. As Thomas prepared for sleep, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow's work with the same quiet anticipation he had felt as a young apprentice learning his trade. There would be new challenges, seasonal adjustments to consider, perhaps special requests from the castle, or orders from traveling merchants who had heard of his reputation. But beneath all these variables lay the constant foundation of his daily service to Little Thornbury, the reliable provision of good bread to families who had supported him through every challenge and celebrated every success. The last sound Thomas heard before sleep claimed him was the gentle whisper of wind through the thatched roof, carrying with it the familiar sense of home, wood smoke, harvest grain, and the faint yeasty aroma of bread preparing to rise. It was a lullaby composed of all the elements that made his life meaningful, a gentle song of work and rest, community and craft, tradition and innovation woven together into something approaching perfection. In his dreams, Thomas continued his work, his hands shaping loaves that fed not just bodies but souls, creating sustenance that nourished entire communities and connected generations across the flowing centuries. The work continued, as it always had and always would, a continuous act of transformation that turned simple ingredients into life itself. And in the bakery next door, the dough rose slowly through the night, preparing for tomorrow's miracle of heat and time that would transform it into bread. Daily bread, honest bread, bread made with skill and love and the quiet determination to keep serving one loaf at a time until the work was done. But of course, for a baker, the work is never truly done. Each day brings its own opportunities to create, to serve, to perfect the ancient craft that connects us all to the most fundamental human needs. And in that endless cycle of creation and service, Thomas had found not just a living, but a life that honored both his individual gifts and his responsibilities to others. The night settled peacefully over Little Thornbury, and in the morning the work would begin again, as it always did, as it always would, world without end. Amen. And so our gentle baker's story comes to its peaceful close, not with grand gestures or dramatic revelations, but with the quiet satisfaction of work well done and community well served. Thomas found his way to resist without violence, to protect without confrontation, to innovate without abandoning tradition. His story reminds us that even in the smallest acts of daily service, we can find opportunities for creativity, courage, and love. As you drift toward sleep tonight, perhaps you might carry with you the image of Thomas in his warm bakery, hands deep in bread dough, working by lamplight to transform simple ingredients into sustenance and hope. In his quiet way, he changed his world one loaf at a time, proving that ordinary people with extraordinary dedication can indeed make a difference. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere in the turning of the world, there are still those who work through the night to feed others, who find ways to make life better for their communities, who understand that the smallest acts of service can ripple outward to touch countless lives. The bread rises through the night, and in the morning, the work begins again, as it always has, as it always will, in the endless cycle of care that connects us all. Rest now, and dream of golden loaves and warm ovens, of communities bound together by kindness and creativity, of the quiet heroes who shape our world through their daily dedication to serving others. Good night. Years passed in Little Thornbury like pages turning in a well-loved book, each season bringing its own gentle variations on familiar themes. Thomas grew older, his hair showing silver at the temples, his hands bearing the permanent stains and calluses that marked a lifetime dedicated to his craft. But his satisfaction in the work never diminished. If anything, it deepened with each passing year. The village had prospered quietly under the protection of his gentle deception, which had long since ceased to feel like deception at all. It had simply become the way things were done. The castle received its elegant breads, the village received its nourishing ones, and everyone was content with the arrangement. Lord Aldrich had never questioned the system, too pleased with his reputation for sophisticated tastes to examine the mechanics too closely. The seasons had taught Thomas deeper lessons about his craft and his calling. Spring brought not just new herbs and vegetables to incorporate into his breads, but a renewal of hope and energy that infused everything he created. The fresh green shoots of herbs emerging from the monastery garden, the early radishes and onions from cottage plots, even the tender new grass that gave the milk a sweeter flavor. All of these seasonal gifts found their way into Thomas's creative process. He had learned to read the subtle signs that each season offered, the way the air smelled before a spring rain, telling him when to adjust his dough's moisture content, the quality of light on autumn mornings that indicated exactly how long to let bread rise, the depth of winter cold that required slightly more heating time to achieve the perfect crust. These were lessons that couldn't be learned from books or taught through words. They came only through years of patient attention to the natural world. Thomas had taken on an apprentice, young Martin, the miller's youngest son, who showed both aptitude for the work and the kind of quiet intelligence that Thomas had learned to value above flashier talents. Martin was now 16, old enough to handle the more complex aspects of the baking process, but still young enough to learn without the stubborn habits that sometimes hindered older apprentices. Under Thomas's patient guidance, Martin learned not just the technical skills of baking, but the deeper wisdom of serving community needs with creativity and dedication. The boy had good hands for the work, sensitive enough to feel when dough had reached the perfect consistency, strong enough to handle the heavy lifting that the trade required, and deft enough to shape even the most delicate decorative breads. "Remember," Thomas would tell him as they worked side by side in the pre-dawn darkness, "the bread we make feeds more than just the body. It feeds hope, comfort, the sense of being cared for. That's why we take such care with every loaf, why we never hurry or cut corners." Martin absorbed these lessons along with the practical knowledge of fermentation times and oven temperatures. He understood that he was learning not just a trade, but a philosophy, a way of seeing his role in the community as something both humble and profoundly important. The young man had initially been attracted to baking by the prospect of steady work and good food, but under Thomas's tutelage, he was discovering the deeper satisfactions of craftsmanship and service. The seasonal rhythms that had once seemed like constraints to be worked around had become sources of endless inspiration. Spring brought new herbs and vegetables to incorporate into special breads, wild garlic from the forest edges, tender young nettles that added both flavor and nutrition, early peas that could be ground and mixed with flour to create unusual, green-tinged loaves that delighted children and impressed adults. Summer offered berries and flowers that could transform ordinary loaves into celebrations. Thomas had learned to dry flower petals to preserve their colors and subtle flavors for use throughout the year. Rose petals created pale pink breads with a delicate perfume, while calendula flowers produced golden loaves that seemed to capture summer sunshine. Elder flowers, when properly prepared, added a sweet, muscat-like flavor that made even simple bread feel festive. Autumn provided apples and nuts that created warm, comforting flavors perfect for the approaching cold. Thomas had developed relationships with the owners of local orchards, trading bread for windfall apples that he would dry and grind into meal, or nuts that he would crush and toast to bring out their richest flavors. These autumn breads became anticipated traditions, marking the passage of time and the community's preparation for winter. Winter returned the focus to the fundamental satisfaction of simple, perfectly executed bread that sustained families through the darkest months. But even in winter, Thomas found opportunities for variation, using preserved fruits, experimenting with different grain combinations, creating hearty breads that provided maximum nutrition and satisfaction when fresh foods were scarce. Each year, Thomas refined his techniques slightly, discovering new possibilities within the familiar framework of his craft. He learned to read the subtle signs that indicated the perfect moment for each step of the process, when the dough had risen just enough, when the oven had reached precisely the right temperature, when the bread was ready to emerge golden and fragrant into the world. The bakery itself had evolved over the years, worn smooth by constant use but maintained with loving care. Thomas had made small improvements, a better system for organizing his tools, more efficient storage for ingredients, subtle modifications to the oven that improved its heat distribution. Each change reflected years of experience and careful observation, the accumulated wisdom of a craftsman who had dedicated his life to perfection. The morning routine had become a form of moving meditation. In the darkness before dawn, Thomas would move through his familiar tasks with the fluid grace that comes from thousands of repetitions. The lighting of the fire, the mixing of dough, the shaping of loaves, each action flowed naturally into the next, creating a rhythm that connected him to the deep patterns of creation and renewal that governed all life. But perhaps most importantly, Thomas learned to read the needs of his community with the same sensitivity he brought to his baking. He noticed when families were struggling and adjusted his prices accordingly, sometimes accepting payment in labor or goods instead of coin. He observed which breads brought particular comfort during difficult times and made sure those varieties were always available. He saw how his work connected to the larger patterns of village life and shaped his craft to serve those connections. Young Martin was proving to be an apt student, but more than that, he was becoming a friend and collaborator. The boy brought his own insights to the work, observations about how different weather patterns affected the bread, suggestions for new flavor combinations based on his family's experience at the mill, and the fresh perspective that came from approaching familiar tasks without preconceptions. "Master Thomas," Martin said one morning as they prepared for the day's first baking, "I've been thinking about what you said about feeding more than just the body. Yesterday, when old Margaret came for her bread, and her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her coins, the way you warmed the loaf specially for her and wrapped it in that soft cloth, that wasn't just about making good bread, was it?" Thomas smiled, pleased that his apprentice was beginning to understand the deeper dimensions of their craft. "What do you think it was about?" "Dignity," Martin said after a moment's consideration. "You were making sure she felt cared for, not just fed. You were showing her that she mattered." "That's exactly right," Thomas agreed. "The bread is important, but how we give it matters just as much. Everyone who comes to our bakery should leave feeling a little better than when they arrived." These conversations had become one of Thomas's greatest pleasures. Training Martin wasn't just about passing on technical skills. It was about sharing a lifetime's worth of wisdom about service, community, and the profound responsibility that came with feeding people. The boy was learning to see baking not just as a way to make a living, but as a calling that connected them to the most fundamental human needs. The village had continued to evolve around them. Mary the seamstress had trained her own apprentices, young women who were creating beautiful needlework that attracted buyers from neighboring regions. Her success had inspired other craftspeople to explore their own creative possibilities, leading to a quiet renaissance of skill and artistry throughout Little Thornbury. Old William had passed away peacefully 3 winters ago, but not before ensuring that his knowledge of animal husbandry and weather prediction had been passed on to the younger generation. His informal teaching sessions had become institutionalized as a kind of village school, where practical knowledge was shared and preserved for future generations. Young Peter, no longer young at 28, had become a master blacksmith, whose innovations were sought after throughout the region. His improved plowshares and harvesting tools had increased agricultural productivity, while his decorative ironwork had earned commissions from noble houses. Like Thomas, he had discovered that necessity could inspire creativity that transcended mere functionality. Brother Marcus, now in his 70s, continued his gentle ministrations to the community, though he moved more slowly and his voice had grown softer with age. His sermons had evolved over the years, incorporating the lessons he had learned from watching Thomas and others find creative solutions to seemingly impossible problems. He spoke often of the ways that ordinary people could serve God through their daily work, and of the divine spark that inspired human creativity in the face of adversity. The church itself had benefited from the village's growing prosperity. The roof had been repaired with new slate, the windows had been fitted with actual glass instead of oiled parchment, and a new bell had been purchased that rang with pure, sweet tones across the countryside. These improvements had been funded not through tithing or noble patronage, but through the voluntary contributions of villagers who had prospered through their own creativity and mutual support. As Thomas moved through his daily routines now, he often reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this point of deep contentment. What had begun as a desperate attempt to outwit an unreasonable demand had become a way of life that honored both his individual gifts and his responsibilities to others. The gentle rebellion had succeeded beyond his wildest hopes, but its greatest success lay not in the deception itself, but in what that deception had revealed about the possibilities for creativity, service, and quiet resistance in the face of difficult circumstances. The skills he had developed through necessity had opened doors he had never imagined. His arrangement with Lord Geoffrey continued to provide occasional opportunities for special projects that challenged his abilities and expanded his reputation. But these outside commissions, however prestigious, never felt as meaningful as his daily service to Little Thornbury. As Thomas began shaping the morning's first loaves, his hands moving with the unconscious skill of decades, he felt the familiar peace that came with meaningful work. The bread would rise in its own time, the oven would heat gradually, and another day of quiet service would begin. The gentle rebellion had become simply a way of life, creativity and compassion changing the world one loaf at a time. And so we leave Thomas in his warm bakery, hands deep in dough, shaping bread while the village sleeps peacefully around him. His story reminds us that the most powerful changes often come quietly, through ordinary people serving others with extraordinary care. Sleep well and dream of golden loaves and warm ovens, of the gentle rhythm of work that feeds both body and soul. Good night.